At 66, Magic Johnson finally tells the truth about the 53-day nightmare that terrified his pregnant wife. There are specific afternoons that carve a permanent scar across the face of human history, separating existence into a definitive before and after. These moments do not arrive with a gentle whisper or a subtle warning. Instead, they strike with the cold, sterile precision of a surgeon's scalpel, slicing through the very fabric of our shared reality and leaving an entire civilization in stunned, breathless silence. For the global sporting community, and indeed for the history of modern culture, one of those unforgettable afternoons occurred on November 7, 1991, on that cold autumn day, inside the crowded Forum in Inglewood, California. The air was heavy with an unnatural, suffocating tension. Dozens of television cameras stood packed together like silent sentinels, their lenses pointed toward a single wooden podium. The hum of whispering journalists filled the room, punctuated only by the occasional clatter of equipment and the metallic testing of microphones. For over a decade, that arena had been a temple of absolute joy, a place where the lights shone brighter than anywhere else in the world, and where one man's infectious grin had come to define the spirit of Los Angeles. But on this afternoon, there was no music, no cheering fans, and no golden light. There was only a heavy, somber quiet. When Earvin Magic Johnson walked into the room, wearing a tailored gray suit with his shoulders slightly rounded, the flashes of 100 cameras began to blink in a frantic, almost desperate rhythm. The sound of the shutters was deafening, a chaotic mechanical roar that seemed to echo the racing hearts of everyone watching around the globe. Magic looked out at the sea of faces, many of whom were his close friends, reporters who had chronicled his triumphs for years, and teammates who had run alongside him on the hardwood. He took a deep, agonizing breath, adjusted the microphone, and with a courage that defied comprehension, spoke 5 simple words that instantly stopped the world from spinning. "I have the HIV virus." In that single agonizing second, the golden era of basketball collapsed. The greatest point guard to ever step onto a basketball court, the smiling maestro of Showtime, the man who seemed entirely immune to gravity and sadness alike, was announcing his immediate retirement from the sport of basketball at the young age of 32, at the absolute pinnacle of his physical power, when he was widely regarded as one of the most dominant and beloved human beings on the planet. An invisible, microscopic enemy had done what no defender, no rival team, and no physical barrier had ever been able to achieve. He was being forcibly and permanently removed from the court. But what the sensationalized headlines of that era failed to capture, and what remained buried beneath the mountain of public speculation, moral judgment, and media frenzy that followed, was the true human price that this legend and his family were about to pay. The real tragedy of Magic Johnson was not the sudden and premature termination of his basketball career, nor was it the loss of his multi-million-dollar endorsements or his public stature. The true tragedy was the agonizing journey of the 35 years that followed that fateful press conference. It was a lifetime defined by constant, suffocating fear, by relentless and merciless public scrutiny, by deep, silent personal losses, and by a grueling, invisible medical war fought in the quietest corners of his own body. Today, at 66 years old, Earvin Johnson is still standing. He still possesses that legendary, room-brightening smile, and he still commands the attention of any room he enters with his unmistakable, towering presence. But behind that famous grin lies a man who has had to bury versions of himself more times than most human beings could ever survive. He is a man who watched his newly built marriage almost crumble under the weight of a devastating, stigmatized diagnosis, who watched his own son face a merciless public trial, and who carried a lethal virus in his bloodstream, while the world debated whether he deserved sympathy or eternal condemnation. This is not a simple sports story about championships and MVPs. It is a profound, honest, and sometimes painful exploration of what happens when the show ends. The crowd goes home, the arena lights are turned off, and a legendary hero is left entirely alone in the dark, with the true, exhausting cost of his survival. But to understand the weight of what happened, we don't need to go back to his childhood yet. We need to go back just 53 days. By the dawn of the 1990s, Magic Johnson was the undisputed king of Los Angeles. He had the money, the fame, the historic legacy, and an unblemished public reputation as an untouchable, smiling superhero whom everyone genuinely loved. In September 1991, he married his college sweetheart, Cookie Kelly, in a small, beautiful ceremony. She was pregnant with their first child. Magic was 32, at the absolute peak of his human powers, and felt completely at peace with his destiny. But that beautiful golden peace would last for only 53 days. Magic Johnson did not discover his condition while running on the hardwood, nor did he feel any physical symptoms of illness. There was no sudden fever, no fatigue, and no loss of breath during his intense training camps. The diagnosis arrived in the most sterile, bureaucratic, and cold manner imaginable, during a routine physical examination required for a major life insurance policy. The blood test, processed in a quiet laboratory, returned a positive result for the human immunodeficiency virus. He received the news in a small, quiet medical office, far away from the cheering crowds, the blinding camera flashes, and the comforting presence of his teammates. There was only a doctor, a sterile desk, and a piece of paper containing a diagnosis that, in the year 1991, was viewed by the vast majority of the global population as an absolute, painful, and rapid death sentence. According to his own recollections, his immediate thoughts did not turn to the game of basketball, his career, his wealth, or even his own impending death. His thoughts turned entirely to Cookie. They had been married for exactly 53 days. She was only in the early weeks of her pregnancy, carrying their unborn child. Sitting in that cold medical chair, Magic was forced to confront a terrifying, suffocating probability. He might have infected his new wife, and in doing so, he might have also sentenced their unborn baby to a tragic, painful death before their life had even truly begun. That agonizing realization, which occurred weeks before any public retirement announcement or press conference, was the deepest and most painful wound of his entire life. The days that followed, while they waited in absolute suffocating silence for Cookie's test results to return, were a period of psychological horror that Magic has described as the closest he ever came to a total mental collapse. He had faced the immense pressure of shooting championship-winning free throws in front of millions of hostile fans, but he had never experienced the paralyzing terror of knowing that his personal choices might have killed the two people he loved more than his own life. When Cookie's test results finally came back negative, the relief was so overwhelming that Magic fell to his knees and wept in the privacy of his home. Their son, Earvin Johnson III, who would grow up to be known to the world as EJ, was born completely healthy and free of the virus in June 1992. But the trauma of those weeks of silent terror left invisible, permanent scars on their marriage and their souls that would never truly heal. When Magic finally gathered the immense strength to stand before those microphones on November 7, 1991, the public response exposed the deep-seated ignorance, prejudice, and fear of that era. In 1991, there was no widespread education about HIV or AIDS. For a decade, the epidemic had been sweeping through communities, leaving a trail of death, shame, and government neglect. The general public associated the virus exclusively with marginalized groups, viewing it as a moral punishment rather than a public health crisis. When a straight, hyper-masculine, and widely adored sports icon like Magic Johnson announced that he had contracted the virus through heterosexual contact, a massive portion of the public did not respond with warmth or compassion. Instead, they reacted with intense suspicion, judgment, and outright fear. The tabloids descended on his private life like vultures, digging into his past sexual history with a cruel, relentless hunger, searching for scandalous details to splash across their front pages. Shock jocks on the radio made heartless jokes at his expense, and thousands of letters filled with hatred, condemnation, and religious judgment arrived at the Lakers' offices every single week. Even inside the one place Magic had always considered his safe haven, the NBA locker room, the poison of misinformation and fear spread with terrifying speed. Karl Malone, the legendary power forward for the Utah Jazz and one of the most prominent players in the league, wrote a public opinion piece expressing his deep hesitation about playing against an HIV-positive athlete. Malone was not alone in his fear. Behind closed doors, several other prominent players whispered that they were terrified of sustaining a simple scratch during a game and contracting the virus through direct physical contact with Magic's sweat or blood. Although medical science had already proven definitively that HIV could not be transmitted through casual athletic contact or perspiration, the collective fear of 1991 was infinitely more powerful than any scientific data. To watch men he had battled alongside for years, men he had hugged and respected, physically distance themselves from him on the court, and publicly state that they were afraid to touch him, was a pain that cut deeper than any physical injury or basketball defeat. Forced by rigid medical protocols, intense pressure from corporate sponsors, and the overwhelming wave of public ignorance, Magic Johnson walked away from the game he loved. At 32 years old, one of the greatest human athletes to ever live was effectively exiled from his own sanctuary. Yet, in the weeks and months that followed his forced retirement, an extraordinary, quiet revolution began to take place in the background of his grief. Mail trucks began arriving at the Lakers' offices, carrying not hundreds, but tens of thousands of letters. These were not letters of condemnation, but raw, honest, and heartbreaking messages from ordinary citizens across the globe. They came from men, women, and frightened teenagers living in hospital wards, small rural towns, and crowded cities, people who had been carrying their own HIV diagnoses in absolute, terrifying secrecy, eaten alive by shame and isolation. These anonymous individuals wrote to Magic because seeing that giant, powerful, and smiling man stand before the world and declare his status had given them, for the very first time, a breath of human dignity. He had not asked to be a tragic hero, nor had he trained to be the public face of a global health crisis. Yet, overnight, Earvin Johnson became the most visible HIV-positive person on the planet. The world demanded that he carry this immense burden with an unshakable optimism, expecting him to display the same bright, flashing smile that he had used during the fast breaks of Showtime. This constant, heavy pressure to perform hope, even on the days when he was internally terrified and grieving, became one of the most exhausting forms of loneliness he had ever experienced. In late 1991, he established the Magic Johnson Foundation, dedicating his life to funding HIV research, education, and prevention, particularly in minority communities that were being systematically ignored by the mainstream healthcare system. But this vital work also locked him inside a public suit of armor, where he was never allowed to cry, show weakness, or simply have a bad day. In the summer of 1992, the United States Olympic Committee extended an invitation for Magic to join the legendary Dream Team. the first Olympic squad composed of active NBA superstars. It was meant to be a moment of pure, golden celebration, but the shadow of his diagnosis followed him across the Atlantic to Spain. Several international players from opposing Olympic teams expressed deep anxiety about sharing the court with him, repeating the same fear and prejudice he had faced at home. Yet, magic played. He stepped onto the courts of Barcelona and played with a joyous, defiant energy that seemed like a direct challenge to his own mortality. He distributed spectacular trademark passes, laughed with fans, and proved to the world that an HIV-positive individual could still compete at the absolute highest level of human performance. The Dream Team captured the gold medal, and for those brief weeks, Magic could look in the mirror and recognize the man he used to be. He attempted a brief comeback with the Lakers in the fall of 1992, but the tension was too high. He quickly realized that the constant discomfort of his opponents, combined with the media's obsessive, microscopic focus on every drop of his sweat, had stripped the game of its joy. He made one final, brief return during the 1995-1996 season, playing 32 games before retiring permanently at the age of 36. The greatest career of any playmaker in history did not end with a championship celebration or a planned farewell tour. It was slowly dismantled over 5 years by forces he could neither see nor control. To understand how a man could carry all of that and still keep smiling, we have to go back further, to who Earvin Johnson was before any of it began. We must journey to the cold, industrial streets of Lansing, Michigan, where he was born on August 14, 1959. Lansing was a city defined by grit, sweat, and the heavy rhythmic hum of the General Motors assembly lines. It was a place where survival was never a given. It was something you had to earn through grueling, back-breaking labor, day after day. Earvin's father, Earvin Sr., was the living embodiment of this relentless blue-collar work ethic. To ensure his family had enough to eat, he worked 2 full-time jobs without ever uttering a single word of complaint or weariness. By day, he labored on the concrete floor of the automotive factory, dealing with the heat, the noise, and the physical toll of building cars. By night, he drove a garbage truck and cleaned commercial office buildings, often returning home long after his children had gone to sleep. His mother, Christine Johnson, worked in a school cafeteria, maintaining a household of 10 children with a fierce, loving discipline and a deep, unshakable faith. In that crowded Lansing home, the young Earvin learned a fundamental truth that would guide him for the rest of his life. You do not sit around and wait for the world to hand you a life. You get up, you step outside, and you build one with your own 2 hands. And the tool that Earvin chose for this construction was an orange leather basketball. He became entirely obsessed with the game, practicing during the sweltering heat of the summer and the freezing winters of Michigan, where he would shovel snow off the asphalt courts of Main Street just to practice his dribbling. He would play until the streetlights flickered on, and then play some more in the dark, imagining himself executing impossible passes under pressure. By the time he was 15 years old, Earvin stood at an impressive 6 feet and 5 inches, yet he played with the speed, agility, and court vision of a much shorter guard. He possessed an uncanny ability to see the court in 3 dimensions, predicting the movements of his teammates and defenders seconds before they occurred. It was during his sophomore year at Everett High School, after a game where he recorded an astonishing 36 points, 16 rebounds, and 16 assists, that a local sports writer named Fred Stabley Jr. coined the nickname that would change his life forever. Struck by the pure artistry of the teenager's play, the reporter told him, "I am going to call you Magic." The name stuck instantly, and within weeks, almost no one in Lansing called him Earvin anymore. At Michigan State University, playing under the legendary coach Judd Heathcote, Magic Johnson did not just play basketball, he revolutionized how the game was experienced. He injected a sense of pure, unadulterated joy into every possession, characterized by his signature no-look passes, lightning-fast transition breaks, and an absolute refusal to let gravity or momentum slow him down. His collegiate journey culminated in the historic 1979 NCAA championship game, a contest that is still widely regarded as the most important game in the history of basketball. On the opposing side of the court stood Indiana State, led by a quiet, stoic, and incredibly deadly forward named Larry Bird. More than 35 million people tuned in to watch that game, making it the highest-rated basketball telecast in history. Magic scored 24 points, grabbed 7 rebounds, and handed out 5 assists, leading Michigan State to a historic victory. But more importantly, that game ignited a legendary, decade-long rivalry that would rescue the NBA from the brink of financial ruin and cultural irrelevance. When Magic was drafted as the #1 overall pick by the Los Angeles Lakers in 1979, he brought that same collegiate joy to a franchise that had grown stagnant and professionalized. His teammates immediately noticed that Magic played every single possession as if he owed a personal debt to the fans who had paid their hard-earned money to sit in the arena. He pushed the ball up the floor with a relentless, frantic pace, smiling at defenders as he blew past them, and throwing emotional, sweat-soaked hugs around his teammates and even the referees. He managed to do the impossible. He made Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, a notoriously private, intellectual, and reserved superstar, laugh and celebrate openly on the court. This was the birth of the Showtime era. Between 1980 and 1988, Magic led the Lakers to 5 NBA championships, won 3 regular season MVP awards, and was selected to 12 consecutive All-Star games. The legendary Game 6 of the 1980 NBA Finals cemented his status as an immortal. With Kareem sidelined by a severe ankle injury, the 20-year-old rookie did the unthinkable. He started the game at the center position, played nearly every spot on the floor, and finished with 42 points, 15 rebounds, and 7 assists to clinch the championship. Yet, the true engine of his greatness was his constant spiritual connection to Larry Bird. Their rivalry was a beautiful, exhausting paradox. They pushed each other to levels of preparation and execution that had never been seen before in professional sports. Off the court, they rarely spoke during those golden years. On the court, they were 2 halves of a singular basketball soul. Magic would later admit that Bird was the only opponent who truly terrified him, not with physical violence, but with a basketball IQ that matched his own. What Magic Johnson did in the decades following his retirement is a chapter of his life that his athletic legacy often overshadows, yet it represents, in many ways, his most extraordinary triumph. In the mid-1990s, he began to build a massive business empire under the umbrella of Magic Johnson Enterprises. But his business strategy was not merely about accumulating wealth, it was a quiet, revolutionary statement about community value. He chose to invest almost exclusively in underserved inner-city urban neighborhoods, predominantly Black and Latino areas that major corporate entities had long dismissed as unprofitable wastelands. Magic opened dozens of highly successful Starbucks locations in places like Harlem, Compton, and Southwest Atlanta, proving to the corporate world that these communities possessed immense purchasing power and deserved the same high-quality infrastructure as wealthy suburbs. He brought state-of-the-art AMC movie theaters to inner-city neighborhoods where residents previously had to travel 40 minutes just to see a film. He did not frame these business ventures as charity or philanthropic handouts. He treated them strictly as highly profitable business opportunities, hiring local residents and reinvesting the profits directly back into the communities He wanted to show the world that these neighborhoods did not need pity. They needed respect as valuable consumers. It was his most concrete, brilliant revenge against a society that years earlier had treated him as a dangerous, unwanted burden. However, his immense financial success, which culminated in his group purchasing the Los Angeles Dodgers for $2 billion in 2012, did not erase the deep personal challenges that continued to unfold in the private corners of his family life. His wife, Cookie Kelly Johnson, is a figure who rarely receives the full public credit she deserves for her quiet, unbreakable strength throughout this journey. When Magic's diagnosis was revealed to the world, she was a newlywed of 53 days, pregnant, and discovering that her husband had contracted a highly stigmatized, lethal virus through sexual relationships with other women during a period when they were separated. Her choice to stay by his side is often treated by the media as a simple, automatic act of marital loyalty. But the reality was incredibly difficult. It required years of painful marriage therapy, brutally honest conversations, and exhausting emotional work to rebuild trust with a man she loved, all while being relentlessly photographed and judged by the global press. "Cookie saved my life," Magic has stated repeatedly. "She gave me a real reason to fight the virus and find a way to survive." And then came the journey with their son, E.J. Johnson. E.J. grew up in a household deeply shaped by his father's extraordinary health history and the total absence of personal privacy. When E.J. came out publicly as gay in 2013, Magic's public support was immediate, fierce, and protective. He stood alongside his son on red carpets and defended him in major television interviews. But the internal process of that acceptance was far more complex than the public saw. Magic had been raised in a deeply conservative, religious, working-class household in 1960s Michigan. He had spent his entire adult life in NBA locker rooms during an era where homophobia was an undisputed, casual norm. The transition to a place where he could fully accept and celebrate his son for exactly who he was required an immense, painful, personal evolution. "I had to grow up," Magic admitted with deep humility. "I had to educate myself, examine my own traditional beliefs, and unlearn everything I had been taught about what it means to be a man." His public willingness to admit that his love for his son required him to change his own heart is one of the most courageous acts of his life, demanding a level of maturity that few men of his generation have ever been able to display. For over 34 years, every single morning of his life has begun in the exact same way. Earvin Magic Johnson wakes up, steps into his bathroom, and swallows his daily dose of complex antiretroviral medications. This quiet, daily routine is almost entirely forgotten in the triumphant public narrative of his survival. Because he remains strong, wealthy, active, and constantly smiling at 66 years old, the public has comfortably allowed themselves to believe that the virus has simply vanished from his body. But the cold reality is that the HIV is still there, resting silently in his cells, requiring constant medical monitoring, frequent blood tests, and a lifelong routine of health care that most men of his age will never have to experience. The experimental combination therapies he began in the early 1990s eventually succeeded in reducing his viral load to undetectable levels, meaning he does not develop the symptoms of AIDS and cannot transmit the virus. But the psychological weight of living under a label that was permanently stamped onto his skin at 32 years old has never fully lifted. He is never just Magic Johnson, the legendary athlete. In the minds of millions, he will always be the man who has HIV. And in his deep, unshakable honesty, Magic has never allowed the world to transform his survival into a simple, inspiring story of individual willpower. He has always used his platform to tell the most uncomfortable, raw truth of that entire epidemic. I did not beat this virus through sheer determination. I am alive today because I was a very wealthy man who could afford the absolute best doctors and the most advanced experimental treatments in the world at a time when thousands of poor people of my generation were dying in overcrowded public hospital hallways because they did not have the money to pay for their survival. The era of Showtime ended a very long time ago. His knees and lower back, worn down by 15 seasons of elite, high-impact professional basketball, demand a painful price every single morning when he steps out of bed. He selects his public appearances with immense care now, preferring to spend the vast majority of his time in the quiet comfort of his home in Florida, sitting alongside Cookie, with whom he recently celebrated 34 years of a marriage rebuilt in the heart of a devastating storm. The true tragedy of Magic Johnson was never the fact that he contracted the virus, nor was it the loss of his final athletic years. The true tragedy was the invisible, exhausting emotional cost of being transformed into a living, breathing monument of hope. He was forced to perform an absolute, smiling strength that he did not always possess, while quietly learning, in the privacy of a fractured home, how to be a better husband, a present father, and an ordinary man fighting to survive each new sunrise. He was broken in far more ways than the public was ever allowed to see beneath the bright, blinding lights of the basketball arenas. But he chose, in every quiet morning of those 35 years, to keep taking his medicine, to keep moving forward, and to keep smiling. He did not do it because it was easy. He did it because Cookie was still there, because EJ and Elisa needed their father to stand strong, and because somewhere in the world, an anonymous, terrified teenager who had just received the same devastating diagnosis needed to look at their television, see that giant, smiling man, and realize that a beautiful, impactful life was still entirely possible. And in the end, that stubborn, beautiful smile he still carries today is not a clever piece of public relations. It is his most magnificent, real, and lasting victory over death itself.